So it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Califf. Rob needs no introduction. He was the founder of the Duke Clinical Research Institute and really the first director, and was actually most recently the FDA commissioner appointed by Obama, but of course moved on by Trump. We'll see where that happens. And so he was commenting in my ear every time, FDA commissioner, FDA said this, and said, well, one of the former FDA commissioners in the audience. And he's now the healthcare lead for Verily and Alphabet. And God knows, Google knows probably more about each of us individually than many of our family members. And the question is, how will they use that in healthcare? And the next question I asked is, when is Google going to get into healthcare research? And he looked at me, we already have. I guess I don't know, and perhaps he's going to tell us. Thank you, Rob.
All right, thanks so much. So, Salim, I know it's running late, and this is your show. Let's see. How long do you want me to talk? I'm going to go for 25. The clock's set on 30, so let's set the clock on 25 so I can. All right, that's good. Yeah, thank you. I have been, as I've already mentioned, I have been following the impeachment closely. I'm happy to report that Ambassador Sondland appears to have told the truth, which is creating all sorts of commotion. And I enjoyed the last few minutes of the previous talk about regulation of AI, because when I had my interview with President Obama, when he was doing the job interview, we spent the first 10 minutes on basketball because he's a huge UNC basketball fan, much to my chagrin. So we had to have the argument about that. But the last 20 minutes are on his view that digital technology was the future to the US economy and also to its health. And he wanted to know the answers to the questions that were raised about how do how can we regulate, because it's going to be needed, while still maintaining pull through of innovation. And this is why we came up with the framework, which is risk-based, but also trying to use something that is called pre-certification, where your use of the technology is based on the demonstration that you have quality systems in place, rather than trying to regulate each algorithm every time it comes out, which would obviously be impossible. So with that, I'm going to go through just some perspectives here. First of all, I finally crossed over to the dark side totally. I retired from Duke University after 50 years of being on the campus, a half a century. Retired last weekend. And I now have a job where I'm half-time at Verily Life Sciences. Think of Alphabet as an umbrella corporation, sort of like J&J. It has 12 different sub-corporations, one of which is Verily, which is intended to deal mostly with the regulated biomedical area. And the second, of course, Google, depicted here as an enormous corporation that you all love and hate at the same time, I'm sure. But Google has recently formed a subset within the organization called Google Health about 6 months ago. Hired David Feinberg, who was running the Geisinger Health System and is a child psychiatrist, which I think will have him very well prepared for the job to put that together. So just be aware I have a direct conflict here that as I talk about this that I've never had before, so it's an adaptation. So here are the main points I want to make. I think the ability to use data to improve outcomes, it's dramatically enhanced by the digital revolution. People will have better outcomes if clinicians who care for them and help them with decisions are actually armed with evidence at the point of care. And I think a lot of what I heard today is just tremendous increase in evidence. But if you go to I don't know how it is exactly here in Hamilton, but you go anywhere in the US, you got a doctor typing into a computer, not even looking at the patient and generally guessing about what the evidence really shows. But we want to go a step beyond that. And it's a general belief, which I've had for a while, but didn't think it would be possible, that people should be armed with evidence in their homes as they go about day-to-day life. There's no reason they should have to wait to come to a doctor to get basic information when everything else they do in life is informed by interaction in the digital world. But in order for that to happen, we got to improve our technology infrastructure, got to reach consensus on how to share data, the risks and benefits, and find the right equilibrium on the curation of information. That is, which data do you trust? Would you trust Hamilton or University of Toronto when it comes to what the right answer is to a medical question? And we got to integrate research and practice so that, and much of what I've heard here, so that when you do have a solid piece of knowledge, that you actually increase the probability that it's going to be implemented in daily life. So the digital divide also is no longer an issue related to access to information. That is, poor people have as many cell phones as rich people now. But there are many, many issues that have to be solved in order to assure fair use of the information that is made accessible. This is my standard slide, and one thing I will just say, I think the digital world does nothing to change the basic paradigm, and I'm extremely pleased to see what's happened here in your institution, where you start out with like a big question. Is there a drug that works for heart failure? Once you have one that works, then you have 3 or 4 that work. You got to figure out how to put them together. You have to figure out how to use it. You got to figure out what the right dose really is in different people. And I could see many of the evolutionary trials that are being run out of here now are really answering the 2nd and 3rd order questions, which turn out to be important. But fundamentally, it's still going to be the case. Most of what we try doesn't work. And when I left the FDA just over 3 years ago, we did a count, and 92% of drugs that got into phase 1 didn't make it to market, either because of toxicity that outweighed the benefits or because the target was engaged, but the summative effect on human outcomes was not what was expected. So we're dealing with an enterprise where unless we provide high quality evidence up front, we got a big problem, because it's impossible to tell what's going to work based on scientific theory. And we still need to use God's gift of randomization. I was talking to Richard Pito about this. And you know, people are tossing around the concept of real world evidence now. And I know this is hard, but just to be clear about it, in US law, real world evidence is not non-randomized evidence. Real world just means you're collecting the data in the real world. The question of what the method is to derive an inference about what it means is an entirely different question. So the FDA would say the best form of real world evidence is randomized evidence collected in the real world with a representative population in practice. But then, as I've seen you develop, there's an entire world after you know what works in terms of figuring out how to implement it and apply it to the population, which is represented on this slide. Now, also just want to note, and this relates to what I was so happy about today hearing the talk. It's bothered me for a long time that despite all of our work, the gap between the evidence we have and the questions that need to be answered is growing. And a decade ago, we were shocked to see that we only had high quality evidence for 15% of the major clinical practice guidelines in cardiology. We raised hell about it. Everybody went to work and worked twice as hard. And now the answer this last year was now it's below 10%. So, but a lot of the reason for that is not just that we haven't answered the first order questions. Every time we answer a first order question, a second, third, and fourth order question is derived that we need to answer. Like coronary reperfusion is good for ST elevation MI. Okay, then how do you open the artery? Should the stent have medication associated with it? If so, what kind? So on and so forth. So it's not a terrible thing, but it's still the case that our evidence generation system is operating at a snail's pace compared to the evolution of technology and new therapies. We just look at heart failure at this last AHA meeting. We've gone from thinking there would never be a new drug for heart failure to now we have 7 or 8 that appear to work, and we've got to figure out the right way to use them. So let me get you in the frame of mind that I'm in, if it's possible, and why I'm so excited about this. And it's in the context of what's called the 4 industrial revolutions. And the first is one that, you know, is quite old, water and steam power. So imagine the world before and after. Before, you could only generate power through human labor. There was no other way to do it. If you had access to steam power, you suddenly had a huge advantage compared to your competition, but you were localized to places where steam power could be generated. And then along came electricity, the second industrial revolution. And the big advantage there is now you could move the distribution of power in any direction over any expanse of land where you could lay a wire to move the electricity around, an enormous impact on civilization. And then the third was, of course, information technology itself. We're all still trying to recover from the advent of the internet. I spent a lot of the day in between listening to the lectures and watching the impeachment, still trying to keep up with my email, which seems to be an impossible and ever-growing problem. But just as we're adapting to the fact that we have ready access to information technology, this fourth industrial revolution is the digital revolution. And this really sort of has a one central dimension, which is that all information is being converted to digital form. And it means when we talk about science of any kind, whether it's mechanical engineering or material science or the environment or space, we're dealing now with multidimensional digitization, which has transformed the way that we can look at and combine information. Now, this is one of many places where the U.S. is falling behind, but when I talk in the U.S., this has become an urgent matter. This is a look at the top 18 countries financially in the world with life expectancy. And you can see 17 are generally moving in the right direction, although, Richard, I'm sorry to report, the one that's emulating the U.S. now is the UK. We still look worse than the UK and the US with in last place with the gap widening. Now, and of course, in every country, we're seeing this effect. This is life expectancy in the US by county. And if you look at what's happening in the UK and now in a number of Western European countries, and I've also done a little homework to see Canada's seeing the same thing. What's happening is the urban and university areas are all looking like Scandinavia. You're seeing this nice increase in life expectancy, higher functionality, adherence to whatever the right diet is. I'm still confused after trying to think through the pure results. But people in rural areas are really going down the tubes. And this is due to a number of factors, and it's quite concerning. But what's really concerning is not just that the differences exist, the gap is widening at a pretty rapidly growing pace. And so whatever country we live in, now that we're in an era where everyone essentially has a cell phone, and soon the internet will be everywhere. Again, whether you think this is good or bad, one of the alphabet companies is Loon, which is a network of high altitude balloons that will provide 5G internet to the entire surface of the earth. Now, you might not want to have that in your area, in which case I'm not sure what you can do about it, but it will be available at a very low cost. But now that we're all connected, we ought to be bringing people together and not separating them, which is the problem that appears to be occurring. So this is just for visual effect, but it really reflects the way I feel about this 92% failure rate with drugs and many other things that we do. A lot of it, I feel like, results from the fact that as we're developing things, we've only been able to look at part of the system. If you're interested in a particular pathway or a particular thing like blood clotting, you look at that, you don't see the whole human system all at one time. So the old analogy of the blind man of the elephant, to me, has represented science in every form. But we're now in an era with unlimited computational capacity where we can look at not only the entire elephant, but the field in which the elephants are interacting and the way that they're interacting. And of course, what this means for people is that what we used to think of as just biological systems can now be broadened into behavioral and social systems that can also be looked at and evaluated. And the ability to compute at an unlimited scale in the cloud allows us to look at the depth of this information in a way that we just couldn't So our own version of this is called Project Baseline, the ultimate in conflict of interest, because I'm a faculty member at both Duke and Stanford, while I now am also the sponsor of this study. But the basic idea of Project Baseline is we can map the world. And again, you may not like the fact that there's a map that has a picture of your house on it that can be accessed over the internet, but in fact, the world is mapped and we depend on it to get places and to drive our cars these days, but we have no map of the human condition. Now we can produce a map of the human condition, of course, not capturing all of the complexity, but increasingly capturing derivatives of the complexity. And as we do this with a group of volunteers, you could just get an idea here of the magnitude of data that can be captured about a human being with tests that are currently available. But what's also notable about this and referred to in this session already is that the majority of the data is not collected in a clinic by a study coordinator. The majority of the data is being collected in people's homes and places of work using digital sensors that are either in their environment or worn on the body in the form of a watch or a cell phone or some other device. But it's not just the amount of data that's important, it's also other aspects of the data. For fun these days in the US, I like to ask students, do you know what this is? And some of us remember the days when the great chief resident in medicine was someone who could go to the library, find the relevant article, copy it on a Xerox machine and hand it out for people. Well, today, people expect to get a result instantaneously, and there's 16 million questions being asked every half second of Google from around the world, and people don't expect to wait more than a second to get the answer to their question. Currently, we just peaked 1 billion questions about health per day around the world. So these are not, they're not coming from doctors and nurses mostly, they're coming from people at home in a variety of circumstances with questions that need to be answered. Although I now believe, although I don't have definitive data, it looks like the #1 instrument now for doctors to find out health information when they're in the clinic is no longer up to date. It's now Google search. So there's a lot at stake when you have 1 billion questions a day being asked in a digital world to get the information right. And we expect to get this at a lower and lower cost. Just for fun, we did calculate what it would have taken to make a cell phone with today's capability in 1985. People say it could be done. It would be $32 million per phone, something not many of us could afford. But now, if we're in India, for example, phones are being given away because it's become a ubiquitous approach to living and just dealing with routine things like going to the store. So just to make the point, the digital revolution doesn't just have to do with the amount of data. It's the ubiquity, the liquidity, the short latency, and now, as referred to in the last talk, the insertion of quantitative algorithms directly into the stream of data as it flows, which has tremendous opportunity for advancement, but also very significant risks that will require regulation. And despite the fact that I think the framework that we developed, which has been improved considerably by subsequent people at the FDA, despite the fact I think it's a good framework, I'm 100% sure there will be some catastrophic things that happen from inappropriate algorithms being deployed in a way which is not helpful. All right, so I'm going to be short on time, so I'm going to just try to give you a visual image of the kind of things that I'm thinking about as we do this. The first is clinical trials, which have been alluded to already, and I've had the fun of working with the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute for the last 5 years, and we now have a network which is up and ready to go. The concept here being that if you link together health systems with their electronic health records and claims data with patient advocacy groups who have interest in having questions answered about their diseases, and with payers who are paying for health care, you could have a very low cost, very rapid turnaround system for answering questions quickly. And I know much the same effort is going on in Canada and with the National Health Service in the UK. But just to give you a flavor for the American kind, of course, it's always more complicated because of the fragmentation. But we have about 1/3 of American health systems in this network now. I never thought I'd see American payers pitching in, but this has happened. And with this system, we now have data that's suitable for simple clinical trials on about 60 million people, and data for observational research on about 100 million people. This is now increasingly being linked in an active way so that potential participants can be notified directly that there's a trial that they would be eligible for, rather than necessarily going directly through the person's clinician, which puts a hold in the system. But the key here is digitally to link the clinician and the patient together so that you're not creating dyssynergy in the healthcare arena. And of course, the first study that we did is trying to answer a question I've always wanted to know the answer to. What's the right dose of aspirin for secondary prevention? People now say it's low dose. There's never been a head-to-head trial of any size. So we've now finished enrollment in this trial, and we'll have an answer soon. But what was really interesting to me is that now with a computable phenotype, in 24 hours, we could identify 671,000 people who are eligible for the clinical trial in these systems. So for common diseases, I can't think of a trial that you couldn't do. I'm not arguing they should all be done in the United States, but the point is this could radically change the way that we get large trials done. But I think just as important for the increasing number of rare diseases that can be treated, it's simply a matter of finding the people with the rare diseases, which was almost impossible until now. Using computable phenotypes, we can do that. All right, now just a few things that we're working on between my life, which I just left at Duke, and what's happening at Google and Verily. Diabetic retinopathy, you're all aware that a machine beats an ophthalmologist hands down, and does at least as well as a retinal specialist in screening for diabetic retinopathy. What's particularly interesting to me, though, having been a doctor all these years, I was always aware that if I didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, or if I was in an argument with my wife, or the kids were not behaving, I just wasn't as good at decision making. And it's easy to see, even with super specialists looking at things like an image, the variability, if you show them the same picture 2 weeks apart, is quite substantial. The machine just doesn't have that kind of variability, and I think it's going to be a major advantage. But again, as has already been mentioned, this is not to replace the ophthalmologist or the optometrist. The vast majority of people with diabetic retinopathy in the world never get screened. The idea is you can put, you don't need to dilate the pupil, you can put a camera in the local pharmacy or drugstore. You just take a snapshot, and for about $2 using machine learning, you can be screened. And if you have diabetic retinopathy, then you need to see a competent person to get treatment. So it focuses the referral where it should be. Secondary for us is very important, and I'm led to believe, based on some conversations here, you may have a similar problem in Hamilton. You got doctors and nurses who are busy seeing the patients who show up to clinic, and sending out reminders for people who they think should come back. But these days, we'd like to be preemptive. And so in our system now, every day there's an algorithm run based on all the information that comes in about all the people in the system that says, here's the list from 1 to 100,000 of the risk of something bad happening to a person over the next period of time. And it's been surprising how often people are identified where you can send a team out to their house or whatever it takes to be preemptive, not because people never wanted to do it, it's just they were overwhelmed with the amount of data and could prioritize based on who showed up at clinic rather than who actually needed the service. So this is streaming data, AI applied to the streaming data, notifying clinicians of risk so that action can be taken. And even more daunting as an ICU director was this issue of reams of data coming in all the time about each individual patient. And so now, like a lot of systems, we've developed a flag that goes up that says, this person looks like he or she has sepsis. And this happens much faster than happens in routine clinical care. Many other systems have done the same thing. Doesn't tell you what to do about the sepsis, which is an interesting question, but it identifies people in real time using streaming information with AI in the loop. And on the Google side, DeepMind, as you know, working with the National Health Service, has developed a flag for acute kidney injury that basically flags that the person has acute kidney injury 12 to 48 hours before the creatinine bumps. And again, we actually need treatments for this problem that work, but they've already shown in before-after studies, at least it looks like if you flag it and bring the team in to fix the volume situation for patients and stop nephrotoxins, that it looks like the outcomes already are looking better. And I think the NHS is going to deploy this system-wide. But the point here is both the inpatient and outpatient system, once you have a pipeline of data and you figure out how to curate it, you can pick any outcome that you want. It might be diabetes outcomes, it might be homelessness, and a prediction can be available online. Critical point though, it doesn't tell you what to do about it. And that's an area where I think a lot of research is going to be needed. Now, I do want to refer you to one link that if I showed it, it would be called an advertisement for a company that I work for. But if you're interested, there was just a firestorm. The Ascension situation was mentioned. It's actually 50 million people use Ascension hospitals per year in the United States. And all that was done actually was to move the data into the Google Cloud. And you could have picked Amazon or Microsoft and done the same thing. But there's also a plan to develop tools that are useful for clinicians. I understand that Hamilton's about to make a purchase of an EHR. If you can show me a group of doctors and nurses that are happy with Epic or Cerner, let me know. But you're going to have to pick one of them because those are your options. You're going to see, if you look at this website, a depiction of, I think, some tools that if you're a doctor or nurses, you're going to hope that we're successful in developing this. One that was relevant that I got a kick out of hearing about, it looks like we can actually take faxes and PDFs and search them just like a Google search. So if you'll be able to see that information as if it were digital information. And then finally, the last part, I'm going to go about 3 minutes over, Salim, so I'll rush along here. As I mentioned, 1 billion searches per day related to health. What should we do with that? This is the most private information a person has, and if Google knows more about you than your family, it's mostly related not just to what you buy, but to your searches that you do. I personally would not want you to see every search I've ever done. I don't know if any of you would be interested in showing all of your searches. Some of you may be saints, I don't know. But for example, when there's an emergency with a child in the US, if both parents are at home, half the time one is calling emergency services and the other is doing a Google search. So there is a lot at stake, we think, in getting the information right on Google search and as helpful as possible. And we're starting by curating the information to just simply make it better and tailored better to the individual. But can we go beyond that? And this is very sensitive. I'm not saying anything specific that we're going to do. A lot of it's got to be worked out with societal discussion. But we have done an experiment that's publicly known with depression in the US. 300 million people in the world have depression. Half never get treated. In the US, the mean time between onset of depression and treatment is 7 years. And as you know, treatments for depression are not curative, but they can help significantly. And so there was a feeling that we had to do something. So what we did was we put a little flag that went up if it looked like you were searching on depression that said, looks like you got depression, would you like to take a survey? And I can't give the exact number, but I'll just say millions of people have done this. It's a PHQ-9, which is a medically validated survey for depression. And if you score a 9 on this, it means you're thinking about suicide. So if you tick box number 9, you get referred to the National Suicide Hotline. If you tick boxes that give you a serious depression score, you're referred to a patient advocacy group. But this brings up a big question. We know about hundreds of thousands of people who have significant depression, and their doctors don't know it, and very often their families also don't know it. I don't have an answer as to what to do with this, but you're beginning to get some sense of where the digital world is going and what might be possible. The last thing to mention is that this world is moving quickly. The human brain has not evolved at the same rate as the digital world. And the most serious manifestation of this is obviously misinformation on the internet, which is a very serious thing. I am only going to be working on health misinformation. I'm not going to be working on political information, misinformation. So don't ask me about that. But we know now that with there issues like vaccines and statins and nutraceuticals, that misinformation resonates with the average human brain better than truthful information. Because if you're deploying truthful information and you're a truthful scientist, you're obligated to relate the uncertainties and the issues about science changing. If you're just telling a lie on the internet, you can tell it very definitively and you don't worry about it. So misinformation reaches more people faster and lasts longer in the internet cycles than truthful information. So we have work to do. And I'll finish with this slide because several people have asked me here, are you saying that you just answer all the questions using AI? And the answer is absolutely no. And in fact, if you look at Google search, improvements in Google search are mostly made through randomized trials. When you check that box, when you sign into Google, you're agreeing to participate in randomized trials. And if you want to change a website in a major way that's going to have an impact, you're required to submit a protocol to a protocol committee, and randomization, often multiple factorial randomizations, are used at the same time to optimize the function of the website. So hopefully this is giving you a little bit of ideas about what's in the future. Some of it's a bit scary, but I think the message from my current position is I hope that you will work with us, because what we're seeing now when people are searching, whether they're doctors or patients or people just trying to make decisions about what do I eat and how do I live my everyday life, people would really like better information, and we're going to need a lot of feedback from the medical and nursing professions in particular, who are the trusted intermediaries here. So thanks for your attention.